question for the day, cultural dominance / real machismo. Is this a red flag? Dating someone new and truly wonderful. He is extremely emotionally mature and communicative. He is a wonderful and healthy daddy, boyfriend, and friend. He is Eastern European and believes in traditional gender norms. Like, really believes in traditional gender norms. But I'm concerned that our power play arrangement is real for him, but only play for me. Has anyone contended with this kind of cultural norm, Dom? Does it contradict with your feminism? What do you think?
This is an amazing question, I think. Yeah. Really fascinating, I think. I do reference in the book at the very beginning the notion that BDSM operates in what I called the twilight of the half real. It's a little real, but not maybe too real. And for each person, you have to decide how real you want it to be. I think we see this all the time in people that like, oh, I want to use handcuffs. It's almost, it's Cosmo, right? Oh, yeah, spice up the bedroom with some fuzzy handcuffs, right? That's play. It's not real, right? But it's hinting at the real. And then there's the lifestyle slave submissive where, no, I'm completely owned by my dominant, and that's leaning much more heavily into, no, this is real. And they even will think that way and speak that way. My dominant really owns me. Right? He can do whatever he wants. And there are people like that on the spectrum of how real or how much play you want it to be. So to some degree, there's just a mismatch here between the two people. That's part of what's going on. Is one person is considering it as play, maybe it's just a bedroom thing. The other person, aspects of it at least, are not just a bedroom thing. Now, there's a lower level in terms of beliefs. So to what degree is it accurate that the belief around masculine dominance and feminine submissive are truly deeply held beliefs? And for the author of this question, she doesn't really believe in masculine dominance and feminine submissiveness. It's a game. That's a game she's playing at, right? Whereas her boyfriend maybe really believes in masculine dominance. Now, in our modern world, that's a very unpopular belief. But it's not wholly unreasonable either, right? Yin and yang are considered, aggression and receptive, or active and passive, and they're masculine and feminine, right? These are very old concepts. They resonate culturally with a lot of people. Broadly, I think they resonate biologically. I think that on some level, the notion of active and passive is an analogy or an abstraction, perhaps, on the notion of penetration, right? Mm-hmm. There's penetrative and receptive sex. There's an active and passive aspect to that. And I think those are abstracted into these notions of yin and yang, or yang and yin, to keep the framework the same. And so he's not wrong that they're real. Right? We like to think it's wrong because there are other political and social consequences that we wanted to avoid. There were abuses maybe happening in certain times of history that we wanted to try to avoid that were a function of industrialization, that there was a conflict between the social norms we had in agrarian societies where the household was the unit of production and the functioning husband-wife team on a farm owned by the lord of the manor to produce grain, that whatever, the entire structure of society was different, and then changed to where the individual's unit of production, but only men could work, and that created discrepancies and abuses and unfairnesses. And that notion, that switch that we're trying to adjust to that, created the first wave of feminism. And that's totally different than the notion that there are genuine biological differences between men and women. Those differences are abstracted. So, for instance, something I talk about a lot is something that's not discussed is there is a significantly higher death rate among male newborns than female newborns. The male neonatal mutation rate is higher. And so one way of conceiving of the value of sexual dimorphism as a biological concept is that, hey, we're going to protect the genetics of the female line, and we're going to play it aces wild with the male line. They get to compete against each other and against nature, and whichever one survives, those are the genes that are best suited to the environment, and they'll be allowed to reproduce with the females, but we kept them safe. And I think culture mimics that. The notion of women being protected is a broad cultural norm. that still exist today. We don't punch women in the face. It's still not acceptable, right? It's not quote unquote equal. There isn't equality in that regard because the notion of protecting the feminine line is deeply biologically wired at a sexual and social and cultural level, but there is no such thing as protection without oppression. All protection comes with some level of oppression, right? You want the protection of not being hit by a car, just whatever? Well, then you can't have a free-for-all. You have to have traffic lights. And there's some oppressiveness in that. Like, you have to follow the law, and then you have to have a class of police officers and judges to enforce the law, and you create something that is somewhat oppressive in order to create that protection, right? So the same is true of trying to protect women, quote-unquote, broadly, is, yes, you end up with men as protectors, right? And the biology similarly follows that nature. Men are on average stronger, on average faster. We consider them more expendable. We consider male deaths funnier than female deaths, right? Like, it's deeply wired into our culture, right? You pick any movie and you see something horrible happen to a guy, put a woman in his place and it's not funny anymore,
sure,
right?
Sure, yeah. The funny death of the male bad guy in a movie, right? That we all
exactly right,
at, right? But
yeah, exactly right. That when you have a female villain, that's not what happens to her. She doesn't die in a funny way.
One of the things that coming out in sharp relief with your answer, as well as the premise of the question, is she is in conflict with urges, perhaps, or archetypes that are deeply rooted in biology and are deeply rooted in our psychological history. The yin and the yang, as you mentioned, the masculine and the feminine, the passive and the active, the receiver and giver. These are deeply rooted archetypes and ways of being, and she is finding an outlet for that in her BDSM and kink life, but then that is running into her modern notion of gender roles and feminism, right? She's being challenged, right? While she described him up ahead as daddy, monster, vampire, king, boyfriend. Yep. So she has already internalized. She's calling him these things. She's not calling him a partner who does all these things. She has multiple labels for him. One of which, by the way, is king, which is very much a dominant, submissive sort of label right there. She didn't use master, but king is a very close second. Mm-hmm. And yet, at the same time, is really struggling with internalizing that completely because it's running into her notions of what it means to be a feminist and what it means to have appropriate, morally righteous gender roles with respect to a man, right? Would you say that perhaps is the root of the conflict there?
Yeah, I think that's another way of saying it. Yeah, for sure. I think that there is this challenge, is that in the third wave of feminism, there has been a shift from it being a political movement, a public, political, social movement, to a personal, private, internal, moral movement, right? And that shift creates problems because now we're not talking about treating women fairly from an economic and hiring perspective. We're talking about certain notions or beliefs or feelings that are not okay to have. Well, but kink lies in the shadows, right? A lot of people would say it's not okay to want to whip your partner at all. There's still states where sodomy laws are on the books, right? Technically, they're not enforced, but there are unnatural sex acts, right? So you're making a moral issue, a moral claim, even legally, out of a private matter. Right? And the reason in most states those have fallen away is we try to create this distinction between, hey, this is what I do in my private life and this is what I do in my public life. It's funny, the social justice far left makes the same mistake that the right makes from a religious standpoint. They have stopped believing that you can separate those things, right? Is that I can truly believe that, and by the way, this is, I think, the other, I'll take a brief tangent here. I think a lot of people struggle with the notion of a bell curve. As simple of a concept as it is, people struggle with it, right? If I say the place for a woman is in the home, right? That's a very broad statement, and people take that to mean all women. Whereas probably a better way to discuss it is on the bell curve of women and their finding true happiness, a significantly higher percentage of them than average will find that in work revolving around the home. That's what the statement really means. Not that there is no woman in the history of humanity that has ever found happiness or fulfillment in a non-home based role, right? And so conflating those two claims is a big basis of like the argument here, right? And similarly, it's like saying, hey, I think her boyfriend here is saying, hey, I do think that there are masculine and feminine energies, and that the feminine energy of people that identify more strongly with feminine energy will find more fulfillment in traditionally feminine roles, household focus, serving, submissiveness, obedience, respectfulness, like guidance, being disciplined, so on and so forth, in the traditional feminine submissive ways. And statistically, more women will identify with that energy. So more women will resonate with feminine archetypes than men will, right? Now, if you state it carefully and nuanced that way, there's a lot less argument, right? But it's also more bulky to say than just, like
women's places in the kitchen.
Right. Or women should be feminine. That's also a should claim, which gets a little dicey, right? I do think though that like the challenge she faces is a product of the problems with feminism. Is now third wave feminism has said you cannot believe that there are differences between men and women. Well, now that's the big problem that so many people have with it, is it's gone too far. It's like, so the obvious biological differences we're seeing in front of us are now, we're not allowed to acknowledge those, let alone the tendencies and psychological differences that men tend to be and prefer to be more aggressive. Women tend to prefer men being more aggressive. Women choose men who demonstrate, confidence is code for what, right? Confidence is code for aggression. Right, for the yang energy. That's confidence. It's the willingness to do things, to take action, to take charge, to take the lead, to make a plan and follow it through. This is yang energy. It's all different, which is just masculine energy, right? Whereas following a plan, falling in line, submitting, these are yin energy. There's reception there. There's receptiveness. And so, it is in contradiction with modern feminism. Maybe not first wave feminism, which was a political social movement that, hey, women should have the right and freedom to earn a wage, should not be stuck economically with abusive men because there's no way for them to become independent. There's a moral harm in preventing them from finding economic freedom, right? That's a very different thing, and I think doesn't conflict with sexuality in these ways, whereas modern feminism does. I'm reminded there was an early wave feminist, and I've forgotten the name, but she used to give speeches and start the speech by thanking her husband for allowing her to be there. And she was deliberately being kind of subversive in that regard, right? She was actually giving sort of these feminist speeches, but thanking her husband for allowing her to speak. And she wasn't doing it ironically. She was genuinely saying that I actually still hold to these values, but also think that women should be allowed to achieve economic freedom and should not be stuck in the ways that they have been stuck in the early industrial era.
If you were to wrap up a actionable sort of advice for the OP here, what I would synthesize this as is that your kink is now coming head-to-head with contradictions of your feminist beliefs. And the choice you face now is either, one, you completely change your vampire king, boyfriend, monster, whatever, try to change him to your view, or you could give his worldview a shot. You could try to conform to that worldview and see if it lands for you. And it could be that his brand of dominance in and outside of the bedroom, so much as it's quote-unquote anti-feminist, is something that does not work for you at all. You might be at that end of the bell curve where feminism actually feels toxic to you through and through, or the anti-feminism, the traditional gender roles feels inherently toxic to you and it's not your cup of tea. Or you may find that the cultural wisdom of feminism that was passed on to you in this current milieu was perhaps not serving you well, and you actually find you're happier submitting to a true dominant man who's going to keep you protected, safe. And no one is going to know which of those two it really is until you actually just go ahead and do it. And it almost comes down to, if you want to see if it's going to work, you just have to do it. You have to take a leap of faith, try it out for size, live in that sort of luminal space, be that submissive. And, maybe there's aspects of it that just, listen, this is not something I'm going to accept, right? And then maybe there's some compromise. The needle moves a little bit to the left, right? And then you get to some medium where it's acceptable for both of you, right? There's enough of the traditional gender roles, and there's just enough of a hint of her own sort of vestigial feminist agency to make her feel like she's paying homage to the suffrage movement or whatever it is, right? The only way to know is to just dive right in. You can't really negotiate this, right? You're just going to have to do it and see if it works for you.
I mean, yes and no. I think in this now we can get into the sort of controversial takes here, right? I think that one of the things that's coming out here is one of the things she's really being confronted with is the denial she's in. And these are things that you can't say publicly, right? You can't, but
hold on. Isn't this a public podcast?
Yeah.
Are you going to get us canceled already?
Yeah, hidden carefully behind the anonymity of not showing our faces, right?
Right.
Yeah, but I think that one of the things that comes out is he's extremely emotional, mature, and communicative, wonderful and healthy. He's a great boyfriend. He's a great friend, right? She's throwing out all these things. And what is being challenged here is her preconception of feminism that she inherited. So you said the cultural norm she inherited, and the fact that I think what she really is experiencing is she's happier in his worldview, right? So I think one of the challenges is that she, in being in a relationship with him, in being his submissive, is falling in line with his dominant view, right? His version of this dominance. And it is creating conflict in her with the ideology of what she should find most satisfying. What should she believe? What should she do? And so I would say that the challenge for her is to come to terms with the notion that actually maybe she'd be happier in his worldview, right? And I think I agree with you in terms of trying things on, but I think she's already tried it on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
She's struggling with the positive response.
She's already arrived at the conclusion and is now having cognitive dissonance, which you're calling denial. She's like, hold on a second. Why does this feel so good?
Yes.
I thought I was a feminist.
Her subconscious has arrived at that view, and her conscious mind is struggling with the contradiction with an ideology that she inherited but doesn't necessarily resonate with emotionally, personally.
It's also interesting to note that I don't know what the nationality of OP here is, but Eastern European men are well known. I think most people know this to be traditionally masculine, and Eastern European and Russian as well. I think those traditional gender norms still exist. Interesting to note, if this was an American dating an Eastern European, she's giving this individual some allowance for cultural differences, whereas if it was an American-born New Yorker who was expecting this of an American woman, then he would just immediately be a toxic man, from this feminist perspective, be a toxic man, right? He just straight up, this is toxic masculinity. Whereas because he's Eastern European, well, maybe that's just how they do things down there, right? And there's a little bit more of a cultural allowance there, which is interesting. Maybe I should just tell people from now on I'm from Romania and speak with an accent. That's how you get them to do it.
I will say that is the sort of conceit of the left, is that if you actually knew better, you would agree with me. I think that is one of the core annoyances of dealing with people on the far left, is they act as though their viewpoint is the scientifically educated, incontrovertible view, and any disagreement is merely ignorance or backwardness, right? And so if you're Eastern European, well, maybe I have an explanation for your backwardness that I'll make allowances for. It's still backward.
Yeah, I mean, maybe feminism just hasn't reached your culture yet,
Yeah,
that's not your fault,
Yeah,
Let me
exactly
be the one to introduce it to you, right?
Correct.
That's the underlying current there.
Yeah, I agree with that. However, I think it's interesting that maybe that allowance allowed her to have this relationship, and now she's finding she likes the taste, right? So that's one of those challenges where, and I think you see this all over the place. I don't think this is an uncommon experience. You see this on TikTok, people posting videos of, oh, I was so feminist, and then I got married, and all of a sudden all I want to do is feed him and take care of him. And I think I've heard that from many of my girlfriends too. It's just, oh, hey, I was so independent, boss babe, this and that. And actually, and not just girlfriends, actually friends, right? And actually, I'm kind of realizing that I'm just happier taking care of the house and the kids and fuck my career. I really, whatever, or I'll do it part-time, or I'll do it when I fucking feel like it, but I don't want to be responsible for doing this day in, day out, right? And yeah, I don't think that's uncommon, even in high-end professions, lawyer, doctor, dentist. I think it's not uncommon for women, if they get the option, to say, yeah, you know what, I'm going to do this part-time or as needed or when I feel like it, and mostly I'm going to take care of the kids or the home. The challenge, and maybe the unfortunate challenge I see, is that because they were fed a different ideology when they were younger, that doesn't hit until they're in their late 30s and 40s. And maybe they're already married with kids, and now they're trying to restructure their relationship. Or maybe they've never been erotically satisfied because this conflict prevented them from engaging in kinky behaviors, right? So they chose the ideology, I shouldn't want that, I shouldn't be. And so if this girl breaks up with this guy because he really believes something, she may not find somebody who's emotionally mature and a great friend, or she may find somebody who's emotionally mature and progressive, or a vampire, right? And she may find somebody who's emotionally mature and whatever, and progressive, and she finds that the sex is not that great, right? Because he doesn't believe it enough. He's not believable as a dom. This happens, you see this pop up in the questions all the time, is, oh, well, I really want a dominant person, but I just can't see my husband that way. Yeah, because he doesn't believe it, right? It's a game to him, and you don't want it when it's a game to him. You want him to believe it. Otherwise, it misses that erotic charge.
It needs to be rooted in some degree of like your own identity, right? In this particular man's case, this boyfriend, he comes from a culture where that is just rooted into the culture, right? And as it is in many places in the world. And so he really does believe it, right? And he's also operationalized it in kink, so it's a perfect symbiosis for him. And that's why it's probably landing so well for her, is that it's true for him. It's very real. And she doesn't realize that the reason it works so well is because it's real and it's not played.
The issue.
Right?
That's the issue, is she doesn't realize that's what's making it work. And he's following all the parts of it. And what I mean by that is, the toxic version of this is, I want it in the bedroom, but I'm not going to be a protector, and I'm not going to provide for you, and I'm not going to take the hit when somebody needs to take a hit, and make sure that you're comfortable and happy and safe, and make that the priority even over my own comfort and safety. He seems to be willing to play that full traditional masculine role, both the good and the bad. Whereas I think a lot of people in modern, well, maybe I want the kinky parts, but I'm not willing to buy a masculine code of honor anymore and take the negative parts and take the hit. I still want to split the bill, right? And so, right. And so that's going to be a problem, right? And so she's not realizing how much of what's working there hinges on him taking both the positive and negatives of that sort of quote-unquote older point of view.